Hello all, my name is Kate Harvey and I'm a lecturer in biomolecular sciences at Coventry University, and I've put together a 4-part presentation for you all for the Edward Jenner's Discovery Day, Becoming a Scientist, on the 26th and 27th of September. And hopefully it will introduce you to the immune system, how our immune system works, and the underlying principles of vaccination. So welcome to you all, as I've said, and my name is Kate, and as you can see from this slide, I really love the immune system. So as you can see on the left-hand side, what maybe people do think of when they think of immune cells on a slide is literally a cartoon cell with a smiley face having a great time, literally on a slide. But as you can actually see, generally it's more looking down a microscope, which luckily I also enjoy. But you can often take a blood smear and you can stain the cells so you can look specifically at the size of their nucleus. So that's the genetic material, basically the brain of the cell. And then you can identify the different cells of the immune system in that way. And there are 2 examples of that here. So on the left-hand side, the pink cell with the smiley face, that's what we call a basophil. And this protects us a lot from viral infections and worm infections. And then you can see where the nucleus has been stained. So the big purple area within that cell is the nucleus. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the purple smiley cell, and that's a neutrophil. I really enjoy neutrophils. I think they're one of the best cells that we have in our immune system. And you can see there that the way that's been stained, it looks very different, and that's because the shape of the nucleus, so the genetic material that's inside those cells, is organised in a different way. And at the bottom of your screens, you can see 2 rulers, which I actually bought from Dr. Edward Jenner's house all the way back in 2004, which was the first time that I visited the house when I was doing my undergraduate degree. And although I already loved the immune system, that really has instilled in me my true love for vaccination in particular. And basically, I've continued studying and researching and learning about that ever since. And I think you'll agree they are very good rulers. So I'm just going to give us now an overview of what we're going to cover throughout the next few sessions that we're going to have. So obviously, in short, clues in the name, immunology and vaccination. You might be thinking, actually, the name in Kardashians and Housewives is a bit odd. I'm not really sure how this actually relates to the immune system and vaccination, except for maybe the cows part, because obviously this is for Edward Jenner's house. But hopefully that will become clear as we go through the slides and the different topics. So firstly, we're going to have a think about the actual structure of the immune system. So there are 2 main components of the human immune system. There's the innate and adaptive immune systems, or immune responses. You may not be familiar with these terms, but essentially we're going to go through in this section what innate immunity is, and then in part 2 we'll talk about adaptive immunity. Even though they can be considered to be 2 separate entities, 2 separate parts of the immune system, they actually do coordinate together and work together. And importantly, when we come on to parts 3 and part 4, we're going to be thinking about actually the application of these concepts of both innate and adaptive immunity, and how this basically means that vaccination will work. So to put it quite simply, the innate immune system when you are born is fully functional. Your adaptive immune system is not fully functional, and it adapts and develops as you grow and as you come into contact with pathogens, so things like bacteria, viruses, anything from outside of your body. And in doing so, this actually makes your adaptive immune response much stronger. Your adaptive immune response has what we call memory. And this is kind of the underlying principle of vaccination, because your adaptive immune response, the first time you come into contact with a pathogen, so let's say a virus like smallpox, the response will be very slow and it won't be particularly strong. However, you'll have then cells in the immune system which will remember. So next time you come into contact with that same pathogen, you'll have a very strong immune response. And so then you'll be protected and you shouldn't feel unwell. And that is the underlying principle of vaccination, which, as I said, we'll go through in part 3. And also we're going to be thinking then towards the end of this series, basically structures of some pathogens, certain vaccines that we can produce, and also hurdles that we have when trying to produce vaccinations. So today we're looking at basically structure and innate immunity. So the red and orange parts on the little timeline at the bottom of the screen. Before we can really get into the structure, obviously we actually need to know what the immune system actually is. So just here on this slide, this is one of my favourite descriptions of the immune system and why it's so important, stating that survival requires both the ability to mount a destructive immune response against non-self and the inability to mount a destructive response against self. And what we mean by non-self and self is essentially self is anything that's part of your own body. So all the cells and tissues that make up your own body. Non-self is anything else. So this could be, as you can see on the right hand side of your screen, things like protozoan, bacteria, and also you can see at the bottom part there is actually a 3D image of the coronavirus or COVID-19. So anything like that is non-self, but also anything that's not part of your own body is considered to be non-self. And the only exception to this would be if you had an identical twin, because technically, genetically, you and your identical twin are, clues in the name, identical. So you would be the same. So anything from your identical twin that you put in your body, your immune system would think that it was self, that it was part of you. Unless you have an identical twin, putting anything else from someone else's body into your own body would probably be recognised as non-self, and so your immune system would try to destroy it. So your immune system is very well kind of constructed that you ignore parts of your own body, but you will mount that strong attack against anything that is not part of your body. So you need to be able to discriminate between foreign and also host, which are your own cells, or non-self and self cells. And your immune system does this in a very, very clever way. And it occurs in utero. So as you develop in the womb, your immune system is also starting to develop. So obviously your body is developing, you're growing, your bones are developing, all your internal organs, but also your immune system is starting to develop too. And what happens is, as immune cells start to develop, they're produced in a way which means they shouldn't respond to parts of your own body. And if you imagine when you're in the womb, you've not come into contact with anything that's not part of your body. The only things you've come into contact with are your own genetic material and your own cells. And so basically this means that your immune system hasn't had the chance to be able to respond to anything that's outside the womb. So bacteria, viruses, anything like that, you've not come into contact with those. The only thing that your developing immune cells have come into contact with are parts of you. And what happens is, if any of those immune cells appear to be trying to attack or responding to parts of your own body, they are killed off before your immune system is developed and before you're born. And so in this way, it's called immunotolerance. And basically what it means is it's a mechanism by which your immune system will tolerate your own cells, which is where the name comes from. However, we do know that our immune system will be able to adapt because things like vaccination. So there must be somewhere a difference where you can augment your immune system in a way that it will then respond aggressively to things like the bacteria and viruses that you haven't yet come into contact with. And that's what we're going to fully cover in these sessions. To give a little bit of a physiological background, so thinking about the immune system in the context of where everything is in the whole body, I've got this slide here that you can have a look at. So a lot of people think that actually your immune system is just those immune cells, just the cells that can attack and start to kill pathogens and infections. But actually your immune system has a quite a complex structure. So yes, the blood is very important. The blood is basically the motorways and the A roads which allow your immune cells to get to sites of infection and to pass around your body to ensure that if there is anything that shouldn't be there, that's then actually eliminated from the body. Your blood system, circulatory system, obviously covers the entirety of your body. So that means that basically there's nowhere in your whole system that any nasty pathogens or anything like that can really hide. We've also got things like the spleen, which is essentially a storage. It's a bank, basically, for immune cells where they can sit, they can mature, and also where immune cells which have completed their purpose and need to go and die, they will go there, they will die, and then parts of those immune cells which have died can be recycled and used to help produce new immune cells, which is quite a clever mechanism. So it's like saving and then the interest makes sure your money grow higher. This is essentially, you've saved your cells, and then as things go, the number of immune cells that you have stored in your spleen actually will increase as well. Things like the lymphatics and lymph nodes, basically they're separate to your circulatory system but complementary to your circulatory system, which basically means they're assisting your circulatory system. So they're assisting your bloodstream and they're helping with regards to transport of the immune cells around the body, and also they're important with the production of some of your immune cells as well. Something that's important that people often forget about the immune system is your skin. So your skin is actually covered in innate immune cells. So these are cells which, as I said, are fully functional and present from birth. And your skin is also a very important barrier to prevent actually infection from being able to enter into your body as well. Bone marrow as well. So a lot of people will be familiar with the fact that your bone marrow is incredibly important for the production of immune cells. People who need a bone marrow transplant or things like that, their bone marrow is compromised, and as a consequence of that, their immune system also tends to be compromised because they're not able to produce as many immune cells as they should be able to, or a healthy individual would be able to. When we come on to the second section in this series and we talk about the adaptive immune system, there's one cell type which are called B cells. Most people know them as the cells which produce antibodies. And B cells are produced in the bone marrow and they actually mature there as well. So they fully develop there in the bone marrow too. There's another type of cell in the adaptive immune system which are called T cells, and they are also produced in the bone marrow, but they don't stay in the bone marrow to mature. Instead, they migrate to the thymus, which you can see labelled on the diagram, and that's when actually they start to mature. Quite often, the immune cells that we have, as I said, they circulate through the blood and lymphatics around the body. But you do have some specific cells, so in the brain, the lungs and the liver, which are what we call resident cells. And what this means is that they are immune cells which are produced in the bone marrow, move around the body through the blood, and then they'll find an organ or a tissue where actually then they become resident. They basically live there and they stay there until an infection comes along. And some, as I said, examples of that are places like the brain, the lungs, and also the liver. So they will no longer circulate through the blood. They're basically sitting there waiting in case an infection comes. Within these presentations that we're doing. We can't unfortunately cover every single type of immune cell that we have because there's simply not enough time. Half of my degree was in immunology, and I probably still haven't covered every single type of immune cell that there is. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 main cell types for both the innate and the adaptive immune response. And I call the innate immune response the day-to-day response. So this is where my Housewives comes from in the title. So we have macrophages. So these are cells which are known as phagocytes. And even though it's maybe not politically correct and a bit sexist, I do call them the housewives. Doesn't have to be a housewife. But essentially what they do is they go around the body and they hoover up. So anything that's non-self, that's within the body that shouldn't be there, macrophages should be able to basically come along and they essentially eat it and then remove it from the body. Neutrophils, if you remember those old advertisements where they'd say call 999 for information. I feel as though these are sort of part of the emergency services and I'm saying 999 for inflammation. They work in a similar way to macrophages, that they're also phagocytes and they're able to move around the body and also phagocytose, so eat up foreign material. Unlike macrophages, neutrophils are able to squeeze out of the blood vessels and into tissues. So they're able to actually take up and destroy foreign material that's not just present in the bloodstream. The dendritic cells are the ones that I call the Kardashians of the immune system, because essentially what they do is they show off. So again, like macrophages and neutrophils, they will be able to eat up and take in foreign material, so pathogens and things like that. But what they then do is they show off to the cells of the adaptive immune system what that infection is. And we'll go into this in a bit more detail in the next few slides. But by doing that, by showing that off, it can activate those cells of the adaptive immune system. So the B cells that produce the antibodies and then the T cells that I also mentioned that mature in the thymus. And the last type of cell that we're going to look at in this part of the presentation is what are called natural killer cells. And I call these the Grim Reapers of the immune systems, because what they can do is they can actually kill infected cells, which is really important. The cross on the adaptive side is not because they're not important, it's just because we're not going to cover those even in this segment. In the following segment, that's when we will cover those cells of the adaptive immune system. On the last slide, I mentioned quite a few times the words phagocytes and phagocytosis, and said that 3 of the cells that we're going to look at with regards to the innate immune system are this type of cells. So just to give you a bit of a definition with regards to what we mean by that, basically, as I said, these are cells which are able to circulate around the body and essentially eat up foreign material. So things like bacteria, viruses. And the important thing about that is that once they've done that, they can then show parts of these cells, so these pathogenic cells that they've eaten, to the adaptive immune system. And this is what then essentially wakes up the adaptive immune system and tells the adaptive immune system what to do. This beautiful image, which looks almost like a wonderfully petaled flower, is actually a 3D image of a dendritic cell, which, as I said on the previous slide, are the cells which are what we call antigen presenting cells. And that, as I said, they're the Kardashians of the immune system, pretty like the Kardashians. And what they can do is when they phagocytose all that foreign material, because they've got a really big surface area, because their cell membrane does look like petals of a flower, on all of those petals, if we want to call them that, it will be showing bits of that bacteria or virus, bits of that pathogen. And by showing it to the cells of the adaptive immune system, as you can see, there's a cell here which has then been activated, and the little yellow bits there are the antibodies then that B cell is going to start to produce in order to help further fight the infection. Because the main problem with your innate immune system is that it can't adapt when you come into contact with new pathogens. So your innate immune system stays constant throughout your life pretty much. And so that's why we need the adaptive immune system to kind of come in with the, as I said on the previous slide, battle commences when the day-to-day housekeeping of your innate immune system isn't quite enough to kill off what's probably quite a nasty infection. The first type of the phagocytic cells that we're going to look at are the macrophages. So as we said, these are phagocytic cells, so they do eat up foreign material and destroy it. And if you remember from the slide when I showed you where the different organs and different elements of the immune system fit in through the body, you remember that I did say that there are some cells which actually essentially set up house or become resident in certain tissues and organs throughout the body. And these are your macrophages, essentially. So monocytes, if you ever see the term monocyte, a monocyte is just a baby macrophage. So monocytes tend to be circulating throughout the bloodstream more than macrophages. A lot of the macrophages will move into tissues. And what happens is the monocytes will move through the bloodstream, and then they'll find an organ or a tissue where they essentially want to live. They'll set up house there, and then once they've done that, they will mature into a macrophage. And macrophages are really easy to identify down a microscope because they are absolutely massive. They're the largest of not just our phagocytic cells, but all of our immune cells. And they're very easy to identify, as you can see from this image here, because they've got a very fluid and flexible plasma membrane. So this macrophage here almost looks like it's got arms, and it's trying to attack or eat the round pathogen that's close to it. That's actually just because the membrane of the cell is able to move so much that it can essentially engulf it. So it's a way it kind of holds onto it and then can actually eat up or phagocytose that pathogen. Macrophages are also, I think, quite socially conscious cells as well, because something they're also very good at is recycling. So you're probably aware, or if you're not, don't worry, that your red blood cells have an approximate lifespan of 120 days. And after that, the red blood cells will die, and in healthy individuals are replaced by new red blood cells. Our bodies don't like to be inefficient. And what happens is when the red blood cell has to die, parts of it are then basically scavenged and recycled by the macrophages to help produce new red blood cells. Also, and this is the next cell type we're going to talk about, which is the neutrophils. Once your neutrophil has carried out its action in the immune system, often it then needs to die. And this isn't a bad thing, it's just what happens. And again, when these neutrophils die, your macrophages can phagocytose parts of those dead neutrophils and again help recycle those parts to make new cells and new neutrophils. A bit like the dendritic cells that we'll speak about in a bit more detail, slide after next, your macrophages, when they phagocytose, when they eat up this foreign material, can also show it off to your adaptive immune system. And we call this antigen presentation. So all an antigen is basically, it's just a bit of a pathogen that's already been broken up when it's been phagocytosed by a cell such as a macrophage. So as promised, the next cells we're going to talk about are your neutrophils, and again, this is another example of a phagocyte. They are the most abundant white blood cell, so immune cell that we have within our body. In a healthy individual, they make up over 50%, maybe up to 70% of all the immune cells that you have. And they're very easily identifiable, not like the macrophages because of their size, but because of the shape of their nucleus. And if you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, it almost looks as though that cell has 3 nuclei. So it looks as though there's basically 3 purple blobs, which is where all the genetic material, DNA, etc. in cells is stored. As I said in the introduction, it's basically the brain of the cell. It's not actually separate nuclei. They're not actually separate. They're actually held together. It's what we call a lobed nucleus because it has what looks like lobes to it. But it is actually all one structure. And they think from an evolutionary perspective, the reason that our neutrophils have developed this type of nucleus is because it means it's very, very flexible. So if you imagine that you could pull that apart, you could probably pull it out into a line, couldn't you? Because it's not a big solid mass of genetic material. It looks very flexible. And one of the main roles that a neutrophil has is it's able to squeeze between the blood vessels, so little pores that you have in blood vessels, so little gaps and holes that you have in blood vessels. It's able to squeeze between those and get into tissues and organs where there might be sites of trauma and also sites of infection. And we call this diapedesis. And because of the shape of their nucleus, it means they can basically flatten themselves down and really squeeze between those little pores so they can get to those sites of infection. And sounds a bit strange, but neutrophils are actually probably my favourite type of cell. I absolutely love them. And if you ever do happen to be lucky enough to do a blood smear and to stain your blood in this way and look at it down a microscope, you will see that when you're identifying your immune cells, the majority of them, you'll have loads of neutrophils and probably not very many at all of the other types of cells in your immune system, but that would depend obviously on whether or not you have an infection at the time. One thing that neutrophils can do is they can release chemicals which are called cytokines. And cytokines are basically a signal to tell other immune cells that there's a problem. So by releasing these cytokines, these then pass through the bloodstream and they recruit other immune cells. So they basically say to those immune cells, by the way, over here, there's an infection. So you need to come here to help us fight that infection. And cytokines are very, very important because they also help to activate the cells of the adaptive immune system that we will talk about in the second section. The last type of phagocytic cell that we're going to talk about are the Kardashians of the immune system, the dendritic cells. So, as we said a bit ago, what they do is when they phagocytose material, they can show it off. So they can show off to other cells of your immune system that there's an infection. And they can't show off an entire pathogen or an entire bacterium or virus because it's phagocytosed it. So it's already digested it and broken it up into small pieces. So they show off on their cell surface small pieces of that pathogen. And that's what we've said before, we call an antigen. And so dendritic cells are known as professional antigen presenting cells. So professionally, they show off bits of pathogens to cells of your adaptive immune system, essentially for a living, except unlike the Kardashians, they don't get paid for it. And so basically, they circulate throughout the body and phagocytose the pathogens. This then causes them to mature. So it essentially makes them grow up and allows then, rather than disposing of the chewed up or broken up bits of pathogens that it has inside them, it allows them then to show those off, so it moves throughout the inside of the cell and it shows off to cells of your adaptive immune system little bits of that pathogen on its cell surface, which is, I think, really quite clever. Dendritic cells are probably my second favourite type of cell. They'd be my first, but I spent a long time trying to grow some in the lab, and yep, that was not particularly enjoyable. Neutrophils are much more robust. And so when they're showing off this antigen on their cell surface, this allows, as I said, T cells, so cells of your adaptive immune response, to be able to see it. So it tells the adaptive immune response that there's an infection and allows for those adaptive cells to be activated. And this is what we'll be covering in part 2. And the last type of cell that we're going to talk about in this part, when we're talking about the innate immune system, are natural killer cells. So unlike the other 3 cell types we've just been talking about, natural killer cells are not phagocytes. So they don't go around eating up pathogens and either showing them off or destroying them. What they actually do is they kill infected cells. So for our phagocytes, they're only able to kill things that are actually circulating within the blood. But as we know, for some infections, in particular viral infections, they actually enter into your cells. And so a phagocyte can't phagocytose an entire human cell. It's not going to happen. But what your natural killer cells can do is they can recognize if you have a virally infected cell or an infected cell. And what they do is they move along to that infected cell, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. So they identify that there's an infected cell and they move towards that cell and then they stick to it. So they basically hold on to the side of the cell. And it's the cytokine signals, so those chemical signals from cells like your neutrophils, which tell the natural killer cells to come because there's that infection. And what it does once it's stuck to the side of the infected cell is it's then able to kill it. And it kills it in what I think is a very clever way, because within the natural killer cells there are granules. So these are just little compartments within the cell that basically contain enzymes, and the enzymes generally are inactive. But once it's stuck on to the virally infected cell, these granules then move towards the site where the infected cell has bound to the natural killer cell, and they release these enzymes and these granules. And the first one, there's a box of definitions here, the first one that's released is called perforin. So if you can imagine when you've got a notebook and there's the little holes down the side, and you call them perforations because they're those little holes. Think about that, perforations, perforin. Perforin causes little holes to be produced in the target cell, in the infected cell's cell membrane. And once that's happened, other enzymes, which are in the granules within the natural killer cells, which are called granzymes, are able to pass from the natural killer cell into the infected cell. And what these granzymes do is they cause the cell to die. And it causes it to die by a process that's known as apoptosis. And apoptosis is essentially just a programmed cell death. That's a whole other lecture series if you've never heard of it before. But it's a way to control how the cell dies, so you don't end up with inflammation or anything like that. So it's a very controlled way. And then the parts of the cell which has been killed, we call it an apoptotic cell. Once it's been killed, it can then be phagocytosed by things like your macrophages and your neutrophils. So yeah, it induces cell death mainly by causing problems and damage to the mitochondria in the cells. So the mitochondria in your cells are essentially the batteries of your cells. They produce the energy that a cell needs to stay alive. And so by causing that damage to the mitochondria, the cell will die and go into apoptosis. Something that I think is absolutely fascinating as well is that natural killer cells don't just kill infected cells. So it's not just that they can recognize when a cell is infected with a virus or a bacterium, but they can also recognize tumor cells. And they're one of our best weapons against cancer development. So obviously cancer is still very prevalent within populations, but they believe that cancer levels will be much, much higher if people didn't have functioning immune systems. And so you can see here in the bottom right hand corner that this is a scanning electron micrograph, so essentially a fancy microscope picture of a natural killer cell that's identified and bound to a leukemia cell. And within the space of an hour you can see that now that leukemia cell doesn't look like a cell at all, and that's because it started to break down because it's going through this cell death pathway. And so basically that leukemia cell has now been absolutely destroyed and killed. And I think that that's absolutely amazing that our immune system does have the ability to kill some tumour cells. That's the end of the first part, and hopefully I didn't scare you off too much that you won't listen to the next 3 parts. Hopefully you learnt something, and if you have any questions you can always email me. My email address is there. On the left here is just a very well timed picture. It was an accident of me accidentally standing in front of a picture of a cow in my cousin's kitchen. It wasn't even anything to do with Edward Jenner's house. So thank you for listening. Take care.